We design and manufacture our own rocket engines, so we do not rely on any Russian components at all.
Russia was once a space power. They sent the first man and woman in space and performed the first lunar flyby by using Luna 1, or launched a space flight with more than one crew member through Voskhod 1. In particular, they had the RD-180 engine, which was better than any other rocket engine of its time in many ways, and in a marriage that would have been unimaginable at the height of the space race. This Russian engine was powering an American rocket. This is why Russia has always threatened the U.S. and the rocket industry for nearly 2 decades. But now it is no longer a threat. After 20 years, NASA and SpaceX finally ended the shameful dependency on Russian rocket engines. But how exactly did they do it? Everything is exposed in today's episode of Alpha Tech Channel. Let's get started. For many years, buying Russian-made RD-180 engines was seen as a good idea in the aftermath of the Cold War, especially when relations between the U.S. and Russia had thawed, and developing domestic RD-180s would have meant a significant investment from the U.S. government. The U.S. is licensed to produce a domestic version of the RD-180 if it chooses to, but due to the lack of investment from government and industry, it has never done so. As a result, it's a decision that came back to haunt the U.S. space industry as it clamors to find alternative ways to power the Atlas V in 2014, when Russian Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin sent shockwaves through the U.S. space industry when he announced that Russia would no longer supply rocket engines to the U.S. An unpublished Pentagon study written by retired Air Force Major General Mitch Mitchell in May and obtained by Space News said an eventual Atlas V grounding would delay as many as 31 missions and cost the U.S. nearly $5 billion. Everyone was worried and trying to hold on to Russia except SpaceX CEO Elon Musk, who rattled the U.S. military space launch market, challenging the monopoly of the ULA by suing the U.S. Air Force. Referencing the U.S.'s dependency on RD-180 and sanctions against Rogozin, SpaceX's court complaint said it's hard to imagine any way in which entrenching reliance on Russian rocket engines while funding the Russian military-industrial complex with U.S. tax dollars serves national security interest, especially at a time when the administration has sanctioned individuals associated with the same military-industrial complex over the Ukraine annexation. This definitely became a helpful warning to the U.S. Finally, and on basis of a lawsuit filed by SpaceX, a court order has temporarily suspended the conclusion of new contracts, but on the basis of old contracts, engine deliveries have continued. As a result, studies began for a next-generation rocket engine in the U.S. Elon Musk not only talked, but he acted. He and his team created and developed the Raptor engine, which is completely superior to the RD-180 in every aspect. Frankly, in a way, Raptors are like an attempt to build a better violin than Stradivarius did using modern method. SpaceX has access to better diagnostics and more sophisticated simulation techniques than Glushko did. They also have another design feature important to the American Air Force. They're made in the U.S. Possibly the greatest technical advantage these new engines have over the RD-180 is that they use methane as fuel rather than kerosene as the RD-180 does. Kerosene can gunk up the works of an engine after repeated use. Methane has higher specific impulse and burns cleaner. It's also much easier in principle to synthesize on Mars, which Musk aims to do. Thus, as to whether SpaceX faced risk or opportunity from the halted series of Russian engines, Musk confidently said, "At SpaceX, we design and manufacture our own rocket engines, so we never really relied on Russian components at all." Over the years, as Russia's economy struggled, Roscosmos faced a series of financial issues. Between 2014 and 2020, Roscosmos' budget fell from $5 billion to $1.4 billion. NASA's 2021 budget was $23.3 billion. Last year, President Vladimir Putin declared that Russia needed to master new rocket technologies to compete for commercial space launches against SpaceX, and then proceeded to cut funding for Russia's spaceflight activities even more. Furthermore, the 2022 invasion of the Ukraine, intended to reassert Russian relevance on the world stage, has had the opposite effect in space. U.S. of RD-180 rocket engines, a Roscosmos purchase's helpful source of cash, was also served by themselves. According to Russian state news agency TASS, Russian company Energomash, which builds rocket engines for both Roscosmos and for export, sold its RD-180 engines to ULA for about $9.9 million apiece. As Dmitry Rogozin, the head of Roscosmos, said, Russia had delivered 122 of the RD-180 engines to the U.S. since the 1990s, equivalent to taking in more than $1.2 billion. 98 engines of which have been used, but Russia would no longer be servicing the remaining 24 engines. Roscosmos also said in a tweet referencing the interview with Mr. Rogozin that it would cease selling engines to the U.S. Perhaps in Rogozin's mind, the U.S. still depends on the supply of Russian rocket engines, and to stop supplying them, that's retaliation to the U.S. against the sanctions over Russia and the invasion of the Ukraine. Sadly, things didn't turn out the way Rogozin thought. U.S. Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall said U.S. national security launches will not be affected by Russia's decision. I think our launch needs will be met, Kendall told reporters on March 3rd at the Air Force Association's Air Wayfare Symposium. Why are they so confident? Well, it's because they have SpaceX. At the rate of producing 7 engines a week, SpaceX not only has enough engines to power its own rockets, but it can also supply other parties. Interestingly, not only SpaceX, but other U.S. private space companies like Blue Origin and Relativity Space are also making their own engines. Therefore, Russia's decision makes no sense to the U.S. On the contrary, Russian space itself depends on rocket engine supplies to the U.S., and the decision to stop selling has caused the already narrow source of income to become exhausted. The industry, which has been deeply hurt by Western sanctions, is now becoming more and more difficult because of its increasingly drying financial resources. What's more, Roscosmos responded to sanctions from the European Union and the UK by suspending rocket operations and recalling Russian staff from the French Guiana spaceport. That left a bunch of European satellites and one space telescope in search of new launch vehicles. SpaceX's Falcon 9 has already swept up other customers, severing ties with Moscow's increasingly isolated space sector amid the Ukraine conflict. But a high-profile European mission could be seen as a significant win for the U.S. rocket maker. Satellite internet from OneWeb, a competitor to SpaceX's Starlink satellite internet venture, booked at least one Falcon 9 launch in March. Early this month, Northrop Grumman booked 3 Falcon 9 missions to ferry NASA cargo to the ISS while it designs a new version of its Antares rocket, whose Russian-made engines were withdrawn by Moscow in response to sanctions. After all, by destroying collaborations with Europe and the U.S., Russia has transformed itself into the world's first former space power. Well, that about wraps it up for today's episode. Don't forget, share those ideas about today's episode right there in the comment section. Your support is motivation for us to create more quality content. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.